So at a time when you were despised for doing physical labor, the monks, in effect, made it something honorable. At a time when agriculture was collapsing, the monks' labor helped to bring it back. The monks were involved in rearing cattle and horses, brewing beer, raising bees and fruit. And all over Europe, they introduced essential aspects of local economies. For example, in Sweden, it was the corn trade that owed its existence to the monks. In Parma, cheese making. In Ireland, salmon fisheries. And in a great many places, the finest vineyards. The monks were also intensely practical in that they stored up the waters from springs in order so that they could distribute them if a drought ever struck. In Lombardy, the peasants learned irrigation from the monks. The monks have also been credited with being the first to work toward improving breeds of cattle instead of just leaving the process to chance. So there's agricultural labor from the monks at a critical time in European history. With the Roman Empire collapsed, the monks show up and do all this critical work. Beyond that, the monks pioneered in machinery and mechanization. The ancient world of Greece and Rome was not particularly heavily mechanized, but Europe of the Middle Ages changed all that. Particularly the Cistercians, which are a reform-minded group of monks from the late 11th century, they built water-powered factories at hundreds of their 742 monasteries around by the 12th century. They used water power for all kinds of purposes, for crushing wheat and fulling cloth and tanning. Far more mechanized were they than anything that had ever been seen in Europe up to that time. They were also great metallurgists. They used the slag from their furnaces as fertilizer. So they were constantly thinking of practical things they could do for the life of Europe. And they instructed Europeans as to how they themselves could do these things. They were also technologically advanced in practical things like clocks. The first clock we have any record of was built by the future Pope Sylvester II in 996, but much more sophisticated clocks were built in the 14th century. But it's not just clocks, and it's not just agriculture. It's charity and education and inventiveness. All these things we're going to look at as soon as we come back from the break. So join me after the break, and let's talk more about these monks. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods, and we're talking about the monks today and their unsung heroism in helping to build and even save Western civilization at critical moments. Let me give you a little quotation from a French scholar writing about the achievements of the monks, because this sums it up in terms of their practical contributions. He writes, in effect, whether it be the mining of salt, lead, iron, alum, or gypsum, or metallurgy, or quarrying marble, running cutler's shops and glassworks, or forging metal plates, also known as firebacks, there was no activity at all in which the monks did not display creativity and a fertile spirit of research. Utilizing their labor force, they instructed and trained it to perfection. Monastic know-how would spread throughout Europe. In fact, even today, we're still only beginning to appreciate fully the extent of monastic technological cleverness. In the late 1990s, an archaeometallurgist at the University of Bradford named Jerry MacDonald found evidence in North Yorkshire, England, of a degree of technological sophistication that pointed ahead to the great machines of the 18th century Industrial Revolution. He found that the monks had built a furnace to extract iron from ore. Now, in the 16th century, which is when the period that that MacDonald was looking at, 16th century England, the typical one of these furnaces in the 16th century had not advanced very far over its ancient counterpart. It was very inefficient. The slag, or it's another word for the byproduct of these primitive furnaces, had a very substantial concentration of iron in it, because they couldn't get to high enough temperatures to get all the iron out of the ore. So the leftover still had a lot of iron in it. But MacDonald found that when he was investigating, that in fact the monks in England had in fact built a furnace where the slag was low in iron content. They were somehow able to get to high enough temperatures to get more and more of the iron out of it, very similar to a modern blast furnace today. So MacDonald says the monks were on the verge of building dedicated furnaces for the large-scale production of cast iron. This is the key ingredient, perhaps, that ushered in the industrial age. And he says that the furnace that he investigated in England was a prototype of such a furnace. Now, what ended up happening to that? Why didn't they develop all these big furnaces? Why do we just see this one prototype? Well, remember, this is the 16th century in England. What's King Henry VIII up to? Well, he's closing down monasteries and confiscating their property so as to reward his well-connected friends. And so Henry VIII helped to destroy this outstanding example of creativity on the part of the monks. Thank you very much, Henry VIII. We'll have time to talk about you in a future episode. But we also now have charitable work. Now, charitable work we're going to spend a whole episode on, but I want to at least pause and say something about the monks' specific contributions to charity. The rule of St. Benedict called for the monastery to dispense alms and hospitality to whatever extent its means permitted. Specifically, it instructed monasteries that all guests who come shall be received as though they were Christ. Now, the monasteries served as free inns where foreign travelers and pilgrims and the poor could find a safe resting place. I love this quotation from an old historian of the Norman Abbey of Bec. He said, "Let them ask Spaniards or Burgundians or any foreigners whatever how they have been received at Bec. They will answer that the door of the monastery is always open to all and that its bread is free to the whole world." In some cases, the monks were even known to make efforts to track down poor souls who, being lost or alone after dark, found themselves in need of emergency shelter. They established contrivances for warning sailors of perilous obstacles. Or, in fact, nearby monasteries often made provision for shipwrecked men in need of lodging. All these were typical contributions of the monks. They also built up the medieval infrastructure and built and repaired roads and bridges. But as part of their charitable work, they were also great physicians for their day. In fact, it was the church that helped to create the hospital in the first place. But the monks went even further, because there weren't hospitals everywhere. But there were a lot of monasteries. And initially, the monks provided medical care to their fellow monks. But as time went on, they realized that they possessed a critical skill that local townspeople also needed. So oftentimes they would go out into the local towns and seek out sick people who were in need of their medical care. Again, I would say that's a fairly unsung aspect of the monastic contribution. But in addition to being great physicians and agriculturists and inventors, they were also great educators. St. John Chrysostom tells us that it was already in his day, around the 4th century, it was already customary for people in Antioch to send their sons to be educated by the monks. St. Boniface established a school in every monastery he founded in Germany. In England, St. Augustine, and here we're talking not about St. Augustine of Hippo, but St. Augustine of Canterbury, St. Augustine and his monks set up schools wherever they went. St. Patrick is given credit for encouraging Irish scholarship. And of course, the Irish monasteries developed into very important centers of learning, and they dispensed instruction to monks and laymen alike. Now, sometimes it's been said that the monks did engage in some education, but they were really only educating their fellow monks. Well, that's, as we've seen, not entirely true. There are plenty of cases we have on record of the monks